Tonight, we are not searching for battles or crowns. We are standing beside a single pot, a low fire, and a room filled with smoke. A place so ordinary that no one thought to sign their name to it. Yet this is where history repeated itself every day. Here, some mastered technique, but never chose the ingredients. Some turned meals into performances of power. Others sold hot food long before anyone called it fast. And for many, one coin, one warm bite meant another night survived. If you want history told quietly, warmly, with a faint, knowing smile, stay. Before you drift any deeper, if this quiet helps you feel safe tonight, you're welcome to stay with us. Subscribing softly keeps this place gentle and lets these nights continue. Now rest. And now we begin our first journey, not into a palace or a marketplace, but into the smallest, smokiest room of all, a household hearth where skill lived in the hands, not the pantry, where technique offered control, even when ingredients refused to cooperate. This is the world of control in technique, constraint in ingredients. We begin exactly where we said we would, not in a hall, not in a market, but beside a low fire that never quite goes out. The hearth is small, the flames are cautious, not roaring. Wood is precious, so the fire is fed slowly, coaxed rather than commanded. A pot hangs above it, darkened by years of smoke, its surface scarred with the memory of countless meals that looked different but tasted more or less the same. This is the center of the household, not because anyone declared it so, but because survival quietly required it. The woman tending the pot does not consult a recipe. There is no book to open, no list of preferences to satisfy. She cooks what exists. That is the first and most important rule. Medieval household cooking was not an expression of desire. It was an act of translation. She translated what the land, the season, the market, or sheer luck had provided into something warm, edible, and repeatable. If barley is plentiful, barley goes into the pot. If cabbage survived the frost, cabbage follows. If meat appears, it is not because she craved it, but because circumstances briefly allowed it. Modern discussions sometimes frame historical cooking as a lack of knowledge or creativity. The evidence suggests the opposite. What was lacking was choice. What flourished instead was technique. She knows the tools intimately, the weight of the ladle, the sound it makes when it scrapes iron, the way liquid thickens when grain breaks down just enough. She knows how long to let a pot simmer before fuel is wasted. She knows how to stretch a meal without making it obvious that it has been stretched at all. This is where her power lives, not in deciding what to cook, but in deciding how. If onions are missing, she reaches for leeks. If leeks are gone, she uses wild greens gathered along the path. If bread is stale, she does not discard it. She softens it, soaks it, breaks it apart, and lets it disappear into broth, where yesterday's loaf quietly becomes today's sustenance. This constant substitution was not improvisation born of chaos. It was structured adaptability. Archaeological evidence from domestic sites, alongside household accounts and later rural descriptions, shows remarkable consistency in this logic. Meals changed ingredients often, but their form remained stable. Thick soups, grain-based stews, pottages that accepted almost anything without complaint. The pot did not judge, it absorbed, and so did she. Listen closely, and the kitchen tells its story without words. The fire crackles softly, never demanding attention. The spoon taps the rim of the pot in a steady rhythm. Grain swells, vegetables soften, steam rises and condenses along smoke-blackened beams. This is not dramatic labor. It is persistent labor. You might expect urgency. You might expect tension. Instead, there is repetition. Repetition is the point. The same motions performed day after day trained the body. The hands learned before the mind ever needed to think. This is why medieval women were often described, even by later observers, as instinctive cooks. Not because they lacked intellect, but because their knowledge lived in muscle memory rather than instruction. She does not measure, she feels. This is also why the idea of control becomes complicated here. From one angle, she appears constrained. She cannot summon food from thin air. She cannot choose abundance. Her ingredients arrive shaped by harvests, weather, trade, and hierarchy, far beyond her reach. From another angle, she exercises absolute command over process. The fire answers to her. The pot moves when she moves it. The meal exists because she understands how long hunger can wait and how far food can be pushed. Historical research into household provisioning makes this clear. Women were often responsible not only for cooking, but for managing stores. Grain bins, dried legumes, salted scraps. Herbs hung in bundles along rafters, chosen not for beauty, but because air circulation mattered. Linen cloths washed and reused as strainers. Nothing wasted, nothing decorative. Efficiency was not a virtue. It was a requirement. Even humor of the period understood this. Medieval jokes about cooking rarely mock hunger. They mock mistakes. Burnt stews, thin ale, oversalted broth. These jokes assume a shared understanding that cooking was constant, unavoidable, and central enough to be laughed at. To laugh at a burned pot is to admit how important the pot was. The work itself filled the space with sound, but not noise. The scrape of spoon against iron, the dull thud of a pestle crushing garlic or herbs, the crack of wood settling in the fire. Sometimes a quiet hum, not for performance, for timing, for comfort, for passing the minutes. To an outsider, it might sound almost musical. To the woman living inside it, it was likely monotony. Yet within that monotony sat something durable. Each action mattered, not symbolically, practically. Her body shows the cost. Backs bent from leaning over low hearths, fingers cracked from constant exposure to heat and moisture, hair streaked with soot no matter how often it was brushed. Smoke stung eyes and lungs daily. This was not romantic. It was functional. Still, resilience shows itself in small ways. She tastes the pot. Not because she expects delight, but because balance matters. Too thin, and it will not satisfy. Too thick, and it will consume fuel wastefully. She adjusts with water, grain, or fat, if any remains. The decision is quick. There is no debate. Medieval cooking at this level was not about recipes. It was about judgment under constraint. And that judgment extended beyond food alone. The same hands that stirred stew prepared remedies. Household records and later ethnographic parallels suggest that women at the hearth held extensive practical knowledge of healing. Herbs were not divided neatly into categories of food and medicine. Sage went into broth and into teas. Honey sweetened meals and soothed coughs. Fats served both cooking and salves. The kitchen doubled as a pharmacy because it had to. When a child burned a hand, the remedy came from the same space that caused the injury. When fevers rose, the response came not from outside authorities, but from what hung drying above the hearth. Cooking knowledge blended seamlessly into care knowledge. The line between nourishment and treatment barely existed. And when food grew scarce, pressure intensified. Historical accounts of famine and hardship often focus on markets and prices. Less often do they linger on kitchens. Yet this is where scarcity was managed most intimately. Meals were stretched further. Bread was boiled into soup. Weeds were ground into flour. Portions shrank quietly. In many accounts, women ate last, not ceremonially, practically. Children needed calories more urgently. Men performing heavy labor required strength. The cook adjusted herself out of the equation when necessary. This was not martyrdom. It was calculation. There is a recurring image in medieval chronicles of women fainting from hunger, not because they had no food at all, but because they redistributed it until there was not enough left for themselves. These moments rarely receive commentary. They are recorded as facts, as expected outcomes. Yet even here, there were moments when the pattern bent. On feast days or rare occasions of abundance, the same skills that stretched scarcity produced joy, dough shaped into small pastries, herbs folded into cheese, honey drizzled where it usually could not be spared. The kitchen briefly transformed from survival space into something softer, not extravagant, just different. And when the fire dimmed, she wiped her brow with her sleeve. The family gathered, bowls in hand. She ladled the stew, portion by portion, careful and practiced. Her own bowl was often the smallest. No one announced gratitude. No ritual required it. The thanks lived elsewhere, in full bellies, in quiet nights, in another day reached. As you stand beside this hearth, you begin to understand the strange balance at its center. Power and limitation coexisting without contradiction. Absolute control over method, almost none over supply. This was the quiet architecture of medieval domestic life. Not written down, not celebrated, but repeated until it shaped entire generations. And from this smallest kitchen, the story expands outward, because once food leaves the home, it begins to mean something else. The pot remains behind, still warm, still waiting. And next comes the journey that widens the room. A web of hands, not a single pair. From a 10-year-old girl learning the weight of grain to her mother who already knows the fire by heart, the pot we left behind is still warm. It does not belong to one person. If you step closer, you begin to notice that the household hearth is never a solitary stage. Medieval cooking, especially at the domestic level, was not the quiet labor of a single woman bent over fire in isolation. It was a shared system, layered, generational, and quietly crowded. A web, not a line. Above the hearth, bundles of herbs hang from the rafters. They are not decorative, their placement is deliberate. Air moves better higher up. Smoke keeps insects away. Drying happens slowly, evenly. These bundles represent months of attention. Someone gathered them in summer. Someone else tied them. Someone remembered which plant was for flavor and which for pain. Knowledge lives here without labels. Below them, linen cloths lie folded and refolded, washed so often they are thin as breath. These are not table linens. They are strainers, filters, improvised tools. They catch grit from grain, pulp from crushed berries, sediment from broths. Cloth is technology here. Simple, reusable, essential. And near the hearth, almost always, there is a child. She is small, barely 10. Her knees press into packed earth. In front of her sits a stone quern, heavy, unforgiving. She grips the upper stone and pushes again and again, grinding barley into coarse meal. The motion is circular, relentless. Her hands are already red. The skin at the base of her thumbs roughened long before childhood should have ended. This is not punishment. It is instruction. Historical and archaeological studies of domestic labor make this clear. Girls entered kitchen work early, not as helpers in the modern sense, but as integral participants, grinding grain, fetching water, sorting vegetables, feeding fires. These tasks did not require explanation. They required repetition. And repetition was how knowledge moved. No one sat the girl down and explained her future role. She learned it by doing it beside her mother, her aunt, her grandmother. This is how the web formed. Cooking was never just about preparing food. It was about transmitting habit. Every motion learned young embedded itself into the body. How to judge texture by sound. How to feel resistance in grain. How to know when enough was enough without asking. The household kitchen was, in this sense, an educational institution, not formal, not written, but highly effective. The sounds here are constant, and they overlap. The dull scrape of stone on stone as grain breaks down, the soft tap of a spoon against iron, the crackle of wood shifting as fire settles. The low murmur of a lullaby not sung for performance but for timing, to keep a baby calm, to keep the cook awake, to mark the minutes without clocks. To an outsider, these sounds might feel almost comforting, rhythmic, predictable. To the women inside them, they were simply the background of life, unremarkable, endless. This is where the idea of monotony enters. Modern listeners often romanticize this world. They hear hearth and imagine warmth, community, togetherness. And while those things existed, they did not erase repetition. They existed inside it. Grinding grain today, grinding grain tomorrow, grinding grain again, even when arms ache and fingers split. The work was not varied enough to distract. It did not offer milestones. It simply continued. Yet within that continuation, something else took shape. Competence. Each generation refined the same skills slightly, not through innovation, but through consistency. A mother corrected a grip, a grandmother adjusted a pace, a child absorbed both without realizing it. This is why cooking knowledge survived, even when other forms of knowledge vanished. Empires shifted, laws changed, markets rose and fell, but the movements of hands around a hearth remained remarkably stable. The web held. Importantly, this web did not always move upward in a clean hierarchy. Knowledge flowed sideways as often as it flowed down. Sisters taught sisters. Neighbors shared methods, widows passed on techniques to unrelated children in exchange for help. Household archaeology reveals this clearly. Similar cooking tools appear across regions with only slight variation, not because everyone followed the same instructions, but because everyone solved the same problems in similar ways. Heat, scarcity, time. You begin to see how the kitchen operated less like a workplace and more like an ecosystem. Each person occupied a role that shifted with age, health, and circumstance. A girl ground grain until her hands were strong enough for heavier work. A young woman managed the fire and the pot. An older woman oversaw storage, timing, and substitution. No one retired. They simply moved positions. And there was humor here too. Dry, familiar, often unnoticed. A child might complain about grinding. The response was rarely sympathy. It was instruction. Slower or you'll waste it. Humor lived in understatement, in small acknowledgments of shared fatigue. Later jokes and poems about women at the hearth often exaggerate scolding or nagging. But those jokes only work because the audience already understood how central women were to these spaces. You do not satirize what is marginal. You satirize what is unavoidable. The very predictability of kitchen labor made it culturally visible. And yet, despite that visibility, individual recognition was rare. The web mattered more than the strand. This is perhaps the most striking feature of domestic cooking in this period. It produced continuity without producing authorship. Meals appeared, people ate, no one signed the result, but dignity existed anyway. It existed in the precision of small acts, in the way a pot was stirred just enough to keep grain from sticking, in the way herbs were bundled and replaced before they lost strength, in the way a girl learned to grind evenly rather than quickly. Repetition did not flatten meaning. It created reliability. And reliability kept people alive. You might expect moments of pause, rest, reflection. There were few, but there were transitions, small ones. As the girl grows older, her tasks change. Grinding gives way to stirring. Stirring gives way to planning. She begins to anticipate needs rather than respond to them. This shift is subtle. It is not announced. One day, she simply knows to add more water without being told. This is how authority emerged. Quietly, without ceremony. Historical research into household roles shows that women who mastered this anticipatory knowledge held considerable influence within families, even if they lacked formal power elsewhere. They knew what was left. They knew what could be spared. They knew when a meal could stretch and when it could not. That knowledge shaped decisions far beyond the hearth. When guests arrived unexpectedly, it was the kitchen that absorbed the disruption. When sickness struck, it was the kitchen that adapted. When scarcity loomed, it was the kitchen that recalculated. The web adjusted. And still, the sounds continued. The rhythm never stopped long enough to feel triumphant. There was no final product to admire. The reward was simply that tomorrow looked possible. This is why the idea of dignity fits here better than pride. Pride requires recognition. Dignity requires only persistence. As the day winds down, the kitchen does not fall silent. It softens, the fire lowers, the spoon moves less often, the quern rests. The girl's hands ache. She does not comment on it. She has learned not to. Pain is not exceptional here. It is information. It tells her when to slow, not when to stop. The mother wipes her hands on her apron and checks the pot one last time. Not because she doubts it, because checking is part of the rhythm. The herbs above sway slightly as warm air rises. The cloths dry again. Everything resets. Tomorrow the same web will hold. And in that holding, something remarkable persists. Not innovation, not expression, but continuity. This is the quiet strength of medieval domestic life, a system built not on individual brilliance, but on shared endurance, on skills passed hand to hand, generation to generation, without ever needing to be written down. Within all this repetition, something stable emerges. Not joy, not misery, but enough. And that, as it turns out, was often the point. And then the kitchen changes its purpose, the hearth as a place of healing, where the same hands that stir the pot also soothe fever, burns, and birth. The web of hands we just left does not dissolve when illness enters the house. It tightens. In medieval homes, sickness rarely announced itself politely. There was no clear boundary between a healthy day and an unhealthy one. A child woke hot to the touch. A finger slipped against iron. A body grew heavy with fatigue for no obvious reason. And when that happened, no one went looking for a separate room, a specialist, or an institution. They stayed where they were. The kitchen did not stop being a kitchen. It simply became something more. This dual role was not symbolic, it was structural. The same space that transformed raw ingredients into meals also transformed pain into something survivable. The hearth did not distinguish between nourishment and treatment. Heat was heat. Water was water. Herbs did not care whether they were labeled medicine or seasoning. Historical household records, medical treatises intended for lay use, and archaeological evidence all point toward the same conclusion. For most people, especially outside elite circles, healthcare began and ended at the hearth. The kitchen was the clinic because it already had everything required. Heat to draw out properties, water to carry them, tools to crush, steep, and apply. And most importantly, someone who knew what to do with them. The woman who stirred the pot now adjusts it slightly. The fire is lower, the liquid inside is thinner. This is no longer a meal intended to satisfy hunger. It is meant to pass easily, to comfort, to hydrate. If someone has a fever, the response is immediate but not dramatic. Water is boiled. Herbs are chosen from the bundles overhead. Sage, fennel, mint, depending on what is available and what the symptoms suggest. The tea is not measured, it is watched. If the steam smells sharp, it is ready. If it smells weak, it waits. This knowledge did not come from books. It came from repetition, from seeing what helped last time, from remembering which child settled after which brew, from noticing that some herbs calmed coughs, while others seemed to make them worse. The medieval kitchen functioned on pattern recognition. It did not promise cures. It promised responses. When burns happened, and they did often, the same logic applied. A splash of boiling broth. A hand too close to flame. There is no panic. There is urgency, yes, but not chaos. The remedy comes from the same place as the injury. Fats are softened. Herbal pastes are applied. Cloths soaked in cool water are wrapped carefully. The goal is not perfection, it is containment. Historical descriptions of domestic injuries rarely linger on suffering. They note outcomes, healing, scarring, survival. This tells us something important. These incidents were common enough to be unremarkable. And because they were common, households developed ways to manage them without spectacle. The kitchen absorbed risk along with responsibility. And then there is childbirth. For most medieval women, birth did not take place in a special chamber, overseen by distant experts. It happened in familiar spaces, often near the hearth, where warmth could be controlled and water easily heated. The same women who cooked daily meals assisted with births. They did not claim authority. They claimed experience. Hands that knew how to steady a pot knew how to steady a body. Herbs again played a role, some to ease pain, some to encourage contractions, some simply to calm fear. There was no clear separation between physical and emotional care. The kitchen did not provide answers. It provided presence. This is crucial to understand. The kitchen as clinic did not operate on ideals of cure or recovery as we imagine them today. It operated on continuity, on keeping the household functioning through interruption. When sickness arrived, work did not stop. It shifted. Meals became thinner. Tasks redistributed. Energy conserved where possible. And when food itself grew scarce, the same logic intensified. Periods of shortage did not always arrive as sudden disasters. Often they crept in quietly. A poor harvest, a delayed market, a missing supply. The kitchen noticed first. Grain bins emptied. Bread hardened faster. Portions required adjustment. This is where the line between cooking and survival became most visible. Bread was boiled into soup, not because it was innovative, but because it worked. Stale loaves softened in liquid. Calories became accessible again. Wild greens were gathered and ground into meal, not because they tasted good, but because they existed. This was not desperation. It was strategy. Historical accounts of famine often emphasize collapse. What they overlook is management. Day by day, households made small decisions that extended viability. The kitchen was the site of those decisions, and again, women bore the weight of them. When resources tightened, redistribution followed a familiar pattern. Children ate first. Those performing heavy labor ate next. The cook adjusted herself out of the equation if necessary. This is not presented here as tragedy. It is presented as arithmetic. Calories mattered. Bodies required them differently. The woman at the hearth calculated silently and continuously. Her own hunger became negotiable. Others did not. Medieval chroniclers occasionally note women fainting from hunger. They do not dramatize it. They record it the way one records weather, as an outcome of conditions. This tells us that such behavior was understood, if not celebrated. The kitchen as clinic also meant that knowledge of healing traveled through the same web we have already seen. A grandmother taught a daughter which herb to reach for first. A neighbor shared a remedy that worked once. A girl learned not only how to grind grain, but how to recognize when someone's breathing changed. Health knowledge was communal, cumulative, and unlicensed. And it was adaptive. If one remedy failed, another was tried. Not out of superstition, but out of observation. Medieval households were pragmatic in ways modern narratives often miss. They did not expect certainty, they expected effort. There is humor here too, if you listen carefully. Some later texts and folk sayings gently mock the kitchen's medical authority. Teas that cured everything, broths prescribed for ailments no one could name. There is an acknowledgement, even then, that the kitchen did not solve all problems, but it tried, persistently, and often that was enough. The same pot that simmered quietly through illness also simmered through recovery. The fire never went out completely. The rhythm never stopped long enough to mark an event as extraordinary. This is perhaps the most striking feature of the kitchen as clinic. It did not separate the sick from the living. It folded sickness into daily routine. A child lay near the fire. A pot continued to simmer. Life adjusted rather than paused. From a modern perspective, this might seem harsh. From a historical one, it was stabilizing. It prevented panic. It kept households oriented toward continuity rather than crisis. And continuity mattered more than comfort. As the fever breaks, nothing ceremonial happens. The brew is finished. The cloths are washed. The pot returns to its usual thickness. The kitchen resets. No one declares recovery. They notice it. The woman returns to her normal tasks, perhaps a little slower. The web tightens again around ordinary life. The girl returns to the quern. The herbs above the hearth are replenished when possible. This dual role, feeding and healing, never required explanation because it never required choice. There was nowhere else to go. The kitchen was already warm, already supplied, already occupied by someone who knew how to respond. And so, without ever being named as such, it became the most consistent site of care most medieval people ever knew. Not heroic, not miraculous, just present. And as we step away from this space, we carry something important with us. An understanding that survival was not achieved through dramatic intervention, but through layered, patient adjustment. The kitchen did not promise to save lives. It promised to keep trying. And often that promise was enough to carry a household through one more night. And then, unexpectedly, the kitchen becomes a joke. Because everyone knew it belonged to women. Where burned stews, thin ale, and sharp tongues turned daily labor into medieval humor. The fire we've been standing beside has done many things already. It fed, it healed, it endured. Now, unexpectedly, it laughs. Not loudly, not cruelly, but often enough that it leaves a trail in the historical record. Because once a space becomes central enough to daily life, it also becomes central enough to joke about. And in the medieval world, the kitchen qualified easily. If history had memes, the hearth would have been an endless source. Across poems, short plays, ballads, and passing jokes, the same themes appear again and again. Burnt stews, ale thinned with too much water, wives who scold, pots that boil over, husbands who complain. These jokes circulated widely, which tells us something immediately important. They were recognizable. You cannot make fun of what people do not already understand. Humor depends on shared knowledge, and the medieval audience knew exactly where the kitchen sat in the structure of life. It was so obvious, so unavoidable, that it became safe territory for satire. The jokes are rarely subtle. A stew is burned because the woman talked too much. The ale is weak because the alewife watered it down. The wife nags because the fire is not hot enough or the pot not clean enough. On the surface, these jokes feel dismissive, but when read carefully, they reveal an unintended truth. The woman is always there. She is always doing the work. The humor assumes her presence as a constant. No one jokes about an empty hearth. Medieval comedic writing rarely mocks cooking as an abstract task. It mocks outcomes, a thin soup, a bitter brew, a meal gone wrong. That focus matters. It suggests that the audience expected cooking to work most of the time. Failure was notable precisely because success was the norm. You do not satirize rarity. You satirize reliability. The kitchen had become reliable enough to disappoint expectations occasionally, and disappointment, of course, is funny. The humor also reveals anxiety. Food mattered deeply. A burned pot meant wasted fuel and calories. Watered ale meant lost value and lost strength. These were not trivial complaints dressed up as jokes. They were pressures disguised as laughter. Laughing made them manageable. This is a familiar pattern in human societies. When something becomes too heavy to confront directly, it becomes something you mock. The medieval kitchen carried weight. Economic weight, emotional weight, physical weight. So it became a punchline. The women in these jokes are often portrayed as loud, sharp-tongued, or controlling. This portrayal has traveled far into later stereotypes. But within the medieval context, it reflects proximity to power rather than absence of it. The woman at the hearth controlled resources that everyone depended on. She decided how much grain went into the pot, how much ale was poured, how leftovers were handled. That authority was informal, but it was real. Comedy has always had a habit of targeting informal power. It is easier to joke about a scolding wife than to admit that she manages the household's survival calculus. Humor makes that power less threatening, more digestible, quite literally. Even jokes about nagging often circle back to the hearth. Complaints about fire, fuel, cleanliness, timing. These are operational concerns. They matter because the kitchen mattered. No one jokes about silence in an empty room. They joke about noise in a room that never rests. Some of the most telling humor appears in passing lines rather than full scenes. A reference to a pot left too long. A remark about ale that tastes suspiciously like water. These throwaway moments assume an audience that understands the daily pressures of cooking. They also assume that the person responsible for those pressures is female. This assumption is not argued. It is not defended. It is simply there. That is perhaps the strongest evidence of all. The kitchen had become such a clearly gendered space that it no longer required explanation. Everyone knew who worked there. Everyone knew who was blamed when things went wrong. And yet, notice something else. The jokes rarely imagine a household without that woman. They do not propose alternatives. There is no suggestion that someone else should take over. The humor critiques performance, not presence. Burn the stew, and you are mocked. Thin the ale, and you are mocked. But your absence is unthinkable. This is not equality, but it is centrality. And centrality brings visibility. From a historical perspective, this matters because it shows how deeply embedded women's kitchen labor was in social consciousness. Long before anyone recorded their names or formal roles, they were already characters in popular imagination. Not as heroes, not as saints, but as fixtures. And fixtures shape environments. There is also a subtle form of resistance embedded in some of this humor. The woman who scolds, who answers back, who refuses to be quiet, appears frequently. She is not gentle. She is not passive. She is sharp, present, difficult. This portrayal may have been meant as mockery, but it also acknowledges something uncomfortable for patriarchal norms. The woman at the hearth had a voice. She had opinions about fuel use, about waste, about timing, about effort, and she expressed them. Comedy gave audiences permission to laugh at that voice, but it also preserved it. These women speak across centuries in jokes, precisely because they spoke in life. And behind all of this laughter sits a quiet, unspoken truth. The jokes work because the audience knows the kitchen works. They know that most days meals arrive. Ale is drinkable, fires are managed, children are fed, illness is tended, scarcity is negotiated. The punchline depends on competence. No one jokes endlessly about total failure. That would be too frightening. They joke about near misses, about mistakes that can be corrected, about moments where the system wobbles but does not collapse. This is how humor protects essential systems. By laughing at small flaws, people avoid confronting the terrifying alternative. And that alternative is clear. Without the woman at the hearth, there is no meal. Without the meal, there is no household. Without the household, there is no society. The humor never says this directly. It doesn't have to. It relies on the audience already knowing it. This is why when we read medieval jokes about cooking today, they feel oddly familiar. Not because the content is kind, but because the structure remains intact. We still joke about kitchens, about burned dinners, about who cooks and how well. The surface has changed. The pattern has not. And if you listen carefully, beneath the laughter is a form of acknowledgement. Not gratitude, not praise, but recognition. The hearth was not invisible. It was too important for that. And the women who worked there, mocked and caricatured as they were, occupied a space so central that even ridicule could not erase it. So when the joke fades and the laughter settles back into the crackle of fire, the pot remains. The spoon returns to its rhythm. The work continues. Because jokes do not feed people. But the kitchen does, and everyone, laughing or not, knew exactly where their next meal was coming from. That knowledge, shared silently across centuries, is why the humor lasted. It was never really about the stew. It was about the woman who made sure there was one at all. And then comes a rare interruption, a night when the kitchen becomes art, when scarcity loosens its grip, and ordinary hands shape something briefly beautiful. After all that laughter, the hearth quiets again, not because the work ends, but because something unusual approaches. Most days the kitchen is a place of calculation. Portions are counted. Fuel is guarded. Ingredients are bent into shape through patience rather than abundance. But every so often, rare enough to be remembered, rare enough to stand apart, the rhythm shifts. A feast day, a wedding, a successful harvest, a visit from someone important enough to justify effort beyond survival. These nights do not erase hardship. They interrupt it. You can feel the difference long before the food is ready. The fire burns a little brighter. Wood is added without hesitation. Ingredients, usually saved, are brought out deliberately. Flour that is normally stretched is handled more generously. Fat that is usually rationed is allowed to hiss in the pan. The kitchen exhales. Small baked goods appear first. Not the heavy daily bread, but lighter shapes. Little pastries, folded carefully. Pies filled not with whatever survived the week, but with what was chosen. Herbs chopped finely and mixed with soft cheese. Dough rolled thinner than usual, as if thinness itself were a luxury. Honey makes an appearance. Not a lot, never a lot, but enough to be noticed. It is drizzled, not poured, over fritters pulled hot from oil. The sweetness is immediate, unmistakable. It does not blend quietly into the background the way grain does. It announces itself. This is not nourishment. This is pleasure. Historical household accounts, along with later rural descriptions, suggest that these moments were carefully contained. They did not last all day. They did not extend into waste. But they mattered precisely because they were brief. The food changes texture. The air changes smell. The kitchen changes tone. The woman at the hearth moves differently now, not faster, more deliberately. There is no rush. This meal is not about efficiency. It is about correctness. Each pastry is shaped intentionally. Each pie sealed properly. Mistakes here would feel heavier. Not because the food is sacred, but because the effort is visible. This is where cooking becomes art, not in the modern sense of creativity for its own sake, but in the older sense of craft, elevated beyond necessity. Art here means care, taken when care is not strictly required. The irony is subtle, but persistent. The same person who has spent months stretching meals, substituting ingredients, and minimizing fuel now spends extra time perfecting details that do not improve survival. This is not contradiction. It is release. The feast does not erase constraint. It acknowledges it. The rarity of the occasion sharpens every sensation. Honey tastes sweeter because it is usually absent. Soft dough feels remarkable because hands are used to coarse grain. And still, the labor does not disappear. The cook tastes less than anyone else. This pattern remains. Historical references and later ethnographic parallels repeated often enough to feel almost structural. The person who prepares the meal consumes the least of it. Not out of martyrdom, out of habit. She has already tasted during preparation. She has already smelled the sweetness. She has already absorbed the moment through work. When the food is finally served, her portion is smaller, sometimes noticeably so. No one comments. Gratitude, when it exists, does not announce itself loudly. It sits in posture, in silence, in the way bowls are held a little longer than necessary, in the way people slow their eating as if afraid the moment might end if they hurry. The kitchen does not become quiet, but it softens. The fire crackles with confidence. The pot no longer needs constant attention. The spoons rest briefly on the edge of the table. This is not rest. It is pause. And then the scene begins to shift. The smell of smoke clings to clothing as always, but now it carries something else with it. Butter, honey, baked dough. The scent travels with the cook as she steps out of the familiar space and into a slightly different one. The doorway matters here. On one side, the low ceiling darkened by years of soot. On the other, a room that feels taller, cleaner, better lit. The difference is not always dramatic, but it is felt immediately. This is the threshold between survival cooking and display. The table is longer, the surface is cleaner, the audience larger. This might still be a household, but it is one aware of being observed. Guests sit straighter, voices lower, movements become more measured. Food here is not just eaten, it is noticed. The same hands that shaped fritters now arrange them. The same skills that managed scarcity now manage impression. This transition is not taught formally. It is learned through repetition of rare moments like this one. Cooking, when watched, changes character. The humor here is quiet. A smile exchanged when someone recognizes an ingredient rarely used. a raised eyebrow at a pie that looks almost too good for this house. These gestures matter. They acknowledge effort without naming it. Naming it would be uncomfortable, because to name it would be to admit how much invisible labor preceded this night. Historical studies of feast days often focus on menus. What was eaten, what was rare, what signaled status. But beneath those lists sits a more important truth. These meals did not emerge from abundance alone. They emerged from restraint, finally loosened. That looseness was controlled. No one emptied stores recklessly. No one forgot tomorrow. The art of the feast lay in knowing how far to go and when to stop. That knowledge lived with the cook. And when the evening reaches its peak, it does not crescendo. It settles, plates empty, crumbs remain, honey sticks faintly to fingers. Someone laughs a little louder than usual, then quiets again. The fire lowers. There is no applause, no speech, no explicit acknowledgement of the work that made this possible, but there is a subtle shift in atmosphere, a shared understanding that something slightly extraordinary occurred. And then it ends. The kitchen returns to itself. Tools are cleaned, leftovers assessed. The next day's plan quietly resumes. The art does not linger. That is what makes it art. It does not demand permanence. It exists in contrast. As the night winds down, the cook wipes her hands and steps back into the darker space she knows best. The smoke returns to its familiar scent. The pot returns to its usual thickness. The rhythm resumes. But something has changed. Not materially, emotionally. The memory of softness lingers. The taste of honey remains faintly present. And that memory does something important. It makes endurance possible again. These rare evenings mattered not because they displayed wealth, but because they reminded households that life contained more than maintenance. That skill could occasionally produce beauty, even under constraint. And so, as we leave this space behind, we carry that contrast with us. From the smoky hearth to the slightly finer room, from necessity to expression, from repetition to pause, because the next place we are going takes that pause and turns it into something larger. Food will leave the household entirely, and when it does, it will stop being quiet. And then the fire moves into public view, the professional kitchen, where cooking becomes contract, portioned, recorded, and enforced. The softness of honey and quiet hearth smoke fades as we step away from the household. The door closes behind us, and with it, intimacy. Ahead is a different kind of kitchen. Louder, larger, sharper at the edges. This one does not exist to care for a family. It exists to serve an institution. The guild hall announces itself before you enter. Long tables stretch into shadow. The ceiling is higher, the air thicker with voices. Tapestries hang not for warmth, but for display. The smell here is different too. Less forgiving, richer, heavier, deliberate. This is where cooking stops being personal and becomes procedural. Guilds of merchants, weavers, metalworkers, goldsmiths were not casual social clubs. They were engines of urban life. They regulated trade, trained apprentices, controlled access to professions, and defended collective interests. And like any organization that wanted to endure, they ate together, regularly, publicly, carefully. Guild feasts marked anniversaries, elected leaders, honored patrons, sealed agreements, and reminded members that they belonged to something larger than themselves. These meals were not improvised celebrations. They were scheduled events, recorded in account books, budgeted down to the last loaf. This is where the kitchen changes character again. Unlike the domestic hearth, where women controlled technique under constraint, the guild kitchen was built around scale and predictability. Feeding dozens, sometimes hundreds, of people required planning that went beyond instinct. It required coordination. And so, professional cooks appear. These cooks were almost always men, trained through apprenticeship, attached to institutions rather than households. Their names appear in records alongside carpenters, masons, and tailors. They were not servants in the domestic sense. They were artisans. This distinction mattered. A guild cook did not cook what happened to be available. He cooked what had been ordered. His authority did not come from adaptation. It came from execution. Menus were planned, supplies contracted, quantities calculated. If domestic cooking was an art of flexibility, guild cooking was an art of control. This is where the phrase food as contract stops being metaphor and starts being literal. In many cities, municipal ordinances and guild records specified exact portions for feasts. So many ounces of beef per guest, so many loaves of bread, so much ale per head. These were not suggestions, they were obligations. The meal itself was an agreement, made edible. Everyone present knew what they were entitled to receive. More importantly, they knew that everyone else was receiving the same. Fairness here was not moral, it was structural. The cook's job was not to delight first, it was to distribute. This required logistics that feel surprisingly modern. Meat had to be procured in advance, bread baked in sufficient quantity, ale brewed or purchased at scale. Timing mattered. Delays created disorder. Disorder created suspicion. And suspicion could dissolve trust. You begin to understand why guild cooks were valued. They were not simply feeding bodies, they were stabilizing relationships. Imagine standing in a smoky hall, watching meat carved with practiced precision, each cut weighed by hand and eye, each portion consistent enough to avoid complaint. Knives move in rhythm, platters circulate, no one lunges. No one waits too long. Order is visible. The humor here is quieter than at the hearth, but it exists. Complaints about short portions appear in records often enough to suggest they were common. Lawsuits against cooks accused of cheating guests were not unheard of. Food might be symbolic, but it was also measurable. You cannot argue with ounces. This insistence on measurement marks a significant shift. Domestic kitchens relied on feel, guild kitchens relied on count. The cook became a manager of fairness. And yet, presentation still mattered. Guild feasts were not bland refueling stops. They were performances of collective success. The food needed to look sufficient, plentiful, worthy of the organization's reputation. Here is where skill re-enters the picture. Some guild cooks became known for elaborate showpieces, jellies molded into heraldic beasts, pies topped with intricate pastry crests, wine fountains flowing into silver cups. These were not daily fare. They were statements, edible emblems. When a lion-shaped pastry was carried into a hall of cloth merchants, it was not just dessert, it was branding. You can almost hear the reaction. Laughter, approval, pride, the sense that the guild was thriving, Scholars still debate whether these dishes reflected everyday medieval taste or were purely theatrical. Did members actually enjoy heavily spiced sauces poured over venison, or were these meals exaggerated spectacles designed to impress? The answer is likely both. Taste here was secondary to meaning. Eating became participation in an idea. The kitchen that produced this spectacle was anything but calm. Large cauldrons bubbled with beef and mutton stews thickened with barley and onions. Spits turned steadily under roaring fires. Apprentices ran with buckets of water, baskets of herbs, stacks of bread. The head cook moved through this chaos like a captain. Orders were short, precise, loud enough to be heard. This was not domestic multitasking. This was command. And beneath it all, measurement ruled. Even excess was regulated. To overserve was wasteful. To underserve was dangerous. The cook balanced on a narrow edge, guided not by instinct but by expectation. This is where the idea of food as contract becomes clearest. The meal did not belong to the cook. It belonged to the agreement it represented. Seating arrangements reinforced this logic. Guests sat by rank. Portions were equal in quantity, but cuts varied in quality. The best pieces went to leaders. Lesser members received what remained. No one needed this explained. Every bite reinforced hierarchy. A goose carved carefully. The breast presented to the guild master. Legs and wings distributed elsewhere. No speeches required. The message traveled through plates. Eating here was not private, it was public and watched. And like all public performances, it sometimes failed. Records hint at feasts ending in drunken arguments, fights over portions, benches overturned. Food binds people together, but it also tests them. The very structure meant to enforce fairness could provoke resentment. Imagine a hall that begins in ceremony and ends in spilled ale. The cook, once respected, dragged before magistrates to explain missing bread. These incidents were notable because they disrupted the norm. Most of the time, the system worked. And when it worked, it did something powerful. It turned eating into evidence of belonging. Members who dined together remembered it. Trust strengthened. Loyalty deepened. Deals felt safer the next day. Cooking here was not just craft. It was infrastructure. As the feast wound down, scraps were cleared. Bones gathered. Dogs darted under tables. Servants moved efficiently. The fire lowered, but did not die. The cook's work was finished, but his success was not measured in compliments. It was measured in silence. No riots, no lawsuits, no shortages. That was the mark of excellence. As we step back from the guild hall, the noise fades gradually. The laughter echoes longer than expected. The smell of spiced meat clings to clothing. Something about this place feels oddly familiar, because the logic did not disappear. We still eat this way. Banquets, conferences, corporate dinners, catered events with fixed portions and careful planning. Food that signals inclusion, food that says, you belong here. The medieval guild hall did not invent this. It perfected it early, and as we move on, the scale shifts again. Because once food leaves the hall and enters the street, contracts dissolve, measurements loosen, control scatters. The next meal will be louder, hotter, faster, and it will not wait for permission. And then the meal stops being quiet. Food is performance, where jelly, pastry, and wine turn dinner into a map, of power. The contracts of the guild hall taught us how food could enforce order. Now we watch it go one step further. Because sometimes medieval cooking did not simply feed people, it spoke to them loudly, colorfully, occasionally absurdly. This is the moment where the kitchen steps onto a stage. If you enter a grand hall during a high feast, royal, noble, or civic, you immediately sense that something different is happening. The air is thicker, candles multiply, tables stretch longer than necessary, servants move with choreography rather than urgency. This is not efficiency. This is display. And at the center of that display are the showpieces, jellies molded into heraldic beasts, lions, boars, eagles, shimmering under candlelight. Their forms wobble slightly as they are carried, translucent and faintly trembling, dyed with plant pigments or spices until they glow red, green, or gold. These dishes are cold, delicate, and technically difficult to execute. They do not exist to satisfy hunger. They exist to be seen. Alongside them come pies crowned with elaborate pastry crests, shields, coats of arms, decorative battlements sculpted from dough. Some pies are sealed so completely that steam hisses when cut, releasing rich aromas like a small revelation. Others are clearly not meant to be eaten immediately. They are admired first. Then there are the fountains. Accounts describe wine flowing continuously from spouts into silver cups, sometimes gravity-fed, sometimes refilled constantly by hidden servants. Either way, the message is unmistakable. We have enough to let it run. These were not everyday meals. They were culinary declarations. Historians still debate what these dishes actually represented. Did they reflect medieval taste? Or were they exaggerated spectacles, reserved only for moments when wealth needed to be demonstrated beyond doubt? The answer matters less than the question itself. Because the very existence of this debate tells us something important. These dishes sat at the boundary between food and symbol. They were edible, but their primary function was visual and social rather than nutritional. They were meant to impress first and satisfy second. This is where the idea of food as language becomes unavoidable. To eat here was to read. Every element of the feast communicated hierarchy. Seating arrangements were precise. Proximity to the high table mattered more than the table itself. The closer you sat to the host, the finer the bread, the richer the sauce, the more elaborately presented the dish. White bread appeared near the top. Darker loaves drifted outward. Spices intensified as rank increased. No announcement explained this. No program was printed. Everyone understood. When a platter arrived, the first slice went to the most important guest. This was not courtesy. It was protocol. The act of carving itself became a public ritual. The carver chose cuts deliberately. The best portions traveled upward, lesser ones followed. Eating a bite was, quite literally, reading your place in the organization. This is where the humor writes itself. You could look down at your plate and know exactly where you stood. One glance at your portion told you whether you were central or peripheral, favored or tolerated, no performance review required. In this sense, medieval banquets were astonishingly efficient. They conveyed power structures instantly and repeatedly, course after course, and the showpieces reinforced this logic. A jelly lion was not random. It mirrored heraldry. A pastry crest matched banners on the walls. Food echoed architecture. The hall itself became edible. Scholars sometimes puzzle over whether anyone actually enjoyed these dishes. Jelly, after all, is not universally beloved. Heavy spicing could overwhelm. Sugar used in savory contexts confounds modern palates. But enjoyment was never the point. Participation was. To be present when such a dish was served was to be included in the moment of its meaning. Whether you finished it or merely tasted it mattered less than the fact that it reached your table at all. And yet we should not imagine these feasts as purely hollow. They were not empty gestures. They carried emotional weight. The sheer effort required to produce these dishes was enormous. Sugar was expensive. Spices traveled long distances. Gelatin required careful preparation. Pastry sculpture demanded time and skilled hands. All of this labor was visible. Which brings us back to the kitchen. Behind every shimmering showpiece stood a frenzy of activity. Large cauldrons boiled. Almonds were ground into paste. Sugar was heated cautiously, watched constantly to avoid burning. Colors were mixed carefully to achieve the desired effect. This was precision cooking at a scale that left little room for error. And yet, despite all this planning, unpredictability remained. Jellies could collapse, pies could leak, wine fountains could fail spectacularly. These moments were dangerous, not because of hunger, but because of embarrassment. Failure here was public. The pressure on cooks in these settings was intense. Their success or failure reflected directly on their patrons. A fallen showpiece was not merely a culinary mishap. It was a social stumble, which explains why so many recipes from elite kitchens emphasize appearance as much as flavor. Color, shape, symmetry, shine. Taste was expected. Appearance was demanded. This is also where scholarly disagreement deepens. Were these dishes eaten in earnest, or were they admired briefly, then removed? Some accounts suggest that subtleties, those elaborate illusion dishes, were displayed and then carried away. Others imply enthusiastic consumption. The truth likely varied by occasion. But what remains constant is the role of spectacle. Food here functioned as propaganda. It demonstrated access to trade networks. It displayed control over labor. It projected stability and abundance. It reassured allies and intimidated rivals. Even silence around the table mattered. A guest who refused a dish could insult the host. A guest who ate eagerly signaled trust. Toasts were not just celebrations. They were affirmations. Every swallow had political weight. This is why banquets often coincided with negotiations. Marriages discussed. Land exchanged. Alliances formed. The meal provided a structured environment where power could be displayed without confrontation. Everyone knew who was in charge. Everyone saw it. Everyone tasted it. And beneath all this grandeur, the structure remained rigid. Servants waited. Dogs hovered for scraps. Leftovers were gathered and redistributed later. Hierarchy extended beyond the table. What makes this moment particularly striking is how consciously artificial it is. Unlike the household hearth, which evolved organically around necessity, these feasts were engineered. They required resources far beyond what was needed to simply eat. They were excess, curated. which is why they stand out so vividly in the historical record. Chroniclers loved them, artists depicted them, writers described them in detail, not because they were typical, but because they were exceptional. And yet they rested on the same foundation as every other meal we've seen. Someone gathered ingredients, someone prepared them, someone managed heat, timing, and risk. The difference is that here, the work was meant to be seen. As the feast progresses, the courses continue. Stews give way to roasts, roasts give way to sweets, sugar sculptures appear, delicate and unnecessary. Guests lean forward, conversations pause, then gradually the tension releases. Plates empty, wine slows, voices rise. The performance concludes. What lingers is not fullness but memory. Guests leave carrying stories of the lion that wobbled, of the pie that steamed dramatically, of the wine that never seemed to stop flowing. These stories mattered. They traveled. They shaped reputations. And so, as we step back from the hall, one truth becomes clear. Medieval food did not only sustain bodies. At its most elaborate, it organized society. You could eat and understand power at the same time. And while few people ever experienced these feasts firsthand, their influence spread outward. Ideas trickled down, techniques adapted, aspirations formed. Soon, food would leave these halls and enter a different arena altogether, one with fewer rules, less structure, more noise. Because once cooking moves into the street, performance changes character. It becomes immediate, and it becomes fast. And then the walls fall away. Food on the street, hot, fast, loud, and gone before anyone calls it dinner. After the careful choreography of banquet halls and heraldic jellies, the street feels almost shocking. It is louder first, then closer, then impossible to ignore. Here, food does not wait for you to sit down. It comes to you. The medieval street is alive with sound long before you notice the smells. Voices overlap. Footsteps scrape stone. Carts rattle. And threaded through it all is a familiar call, repeated in different accents and volumes. Each one trying to catch your attention before the next corner does. Hot pies, fresh pancakes, warm ale, good broth. No ceremony, no seating plan, no hierarchy carved into plates, just hunger meeting opportunity. This is where medieval cooking sheds its layers of symbolism and returns, briefly, to speed. The foods sold here are simple by design. Pies filled with meat or fish, pancakes fried in fat, quickly flipped and handed over while still steaming. Bowls of hot pottage ladled from cauldrons that never seem to empty. Ale heated with ginger or honey, served warm to cut through damp air. None of this is accidental. Street food exists because urban life makes kitchens unreliable. Not every dwelling has a hearth. Not every worker has time to return home at midday. Apprentices, laborers, travelers, widows, and the newly arrived all need calories they can access immediately. The street provides them. Historians sometimes frame street food as a sign of poverty. And yes, it served the poor. But that view is incomplete. Records and regulations suggest that people from across the social spectrum ate this way. A merchant hurrying between meetings, a clerk far from home, a craftsman whose fire was not lit that day. Street food was convenient, not desperate. This is why cities regulated it so carefully. Contrary to popular imagination, medieval authorities cared deeply about food safety, not because they were modern hygienists, but because spoiled food caused unrest. Illness disrupted labor. Angry customers disrupted order. So rules appeared. Meat pies, in particular, were closely watched. Vendors were required in many cities to cut open their pies on demand. This was not hospitality. It was proof. Look, smell, see that it is not rotten. The pie itself became evidence. If the filling was bad, penalties followed: fines, confiscation, sometimes public shame. These measures were not rare. They were written down precisely because street food was so common. The city understood something important. When food is fast, trust must be visible, and trust was built through repetition. A good pie seller became known. A bad one did not last long. Word traveled faster than carts. Reputation mattered. The structure of the pie itself helped. So-called coffin pies appear frequently in descriptions. The name sounds grim to modern ears, but it simply meant a rigid crust. Thick walls of pastry acted as a container rather than a delicacy. They protected the filling, trapped heat, and allowed pies to be stacked and transported. The crust was often not eaten at all. It did its job and was discarded. What mattered was inside. This practicality extends to every aspect of street food. Pancakes were thin, so they cooked quickly. Fat was reused until it could not be. Ale was warmed, not boiled, saving fuel and time. Everything moved toward efficiency. The rhythm here is different. Where the hearth murmured, the street calls out. Vendors advertise loudly. Their cries function like slogans. Simple, repetitive, memorable. You hear them again and again as you move through the city. Hot pies, good ale, fresh pancakes. It is marketing centuries before the term existed, and it works. People stop. Coins change hands. Food disappears into hands and mouths. No one lingers. This is eating as transit. But it is not joyless. There is a pleasure in warmth delivered quickly, in eating without obligation, in standing with others who are also pausing briefly in their day. Street food creates accidental community. For a moment, social distinctions blur. Everyone eats with their hands. Everyone balances bowls carefully. Everyone watches their footing. You cannot perform hierarchy easily while holding hot broth. This does not mean class disappears. It means it softens. A wealthy man might eat the same pie as a poor one, but not for the same reasons. One chooses convenience, the other depends on it. Still, the experience overlaps. This overlap matters. It is one of the few spaces where medieval society allowed different ranks to share a common action without ritual separating them. You eat or you move on. No one waits for permission. This is also where cooking becomes most visible as labor again. Behind each vendor stands someone who prepared the food early, hauled it into the street, and now manages heat and timing under pressure. They watch the crowd constantly, adjust quantities, decide when to reheat, when to stop. Street food vendors lived on margins. A bad batch could ruin them. A slow day could mean loss. Yet they persisted because demand persisted. The city fed itself this way. And as the day progresses, the noise ebbs and flows. Morning rush, midday peak, evening slowdown. Each phase reshapes the menu slightly. More broth when it is cold, more ale when it is damp, sweeter foods when morale dips. Vendors respond instinctively. This responsiveness echoes what we saw at the Hearth, but with higher stakes. The street does not forgive mistakes quietly. It moves on. And yet, for all this noise and motion, the street eventually softens. As evening approaches, fires lower, calls become fewer, pots empty, vendors pack up. The city exhales. The last bowls of pottage are served more slowly. Ale cools. Pancakes thin out. People who ate quickly earlier now linger slightly longer, savoring warmth before night settles. This transition matters because the street, for all its urgency, does not replace the hearth. It supplements it. It fills gaps created by urban density and time pressure. It solves problems quickly, not permanently. As the stalls disappear, the city returns to quieter rhythms. Doors close. Fires are lit again behind walls. The noise fades into echo. Street food has done its work. It fed those who needed feeding, without ceremony or judgment. It connected strangers briefly, and then released them back into their separate lives. And in doing so, it reminds us of something essential. Medieval food culture was not one thing. It shifted constantly between care, contract, performance, and speed. The same society that produced heraldic jellies also depended on hot pies eaten on the move. Both mattered. As the street quiets and the last vendor calls it a night, we are ready to move again. Because beyond the city gates, beyond the rush and the cries, food becomes something else entirely. It becomes endurance. The next meal will be cooked on the road, and then the food begins to travel, on the road and on the sea, where cooking becomes endurance, and every bite is a test of how long you can keep going. When the street quiets and the last vendor douses his fire, food does not disappear. It simply changes character. Now it must move. The city gate closes behind you with a dull sound of wood against stone, and suddenly cooking is no longer anchored to walls, ovens, or markets. It follows bodies instead. Pilgrims, soldiers, merchants, sailors, people whose lives stretch beyond one hearth, and whose meals must survive distance, weather, and uncertainty. This is where medieval cooking stops being about taste and becomes about stamina. We begin on the road. The first thing you notice is how little there is. No hanging herbs, no spare tools, no quiet corner where a pot can simmer all afternoon. What travels must justify its weight. Bread leads the list. Dense loaves baked hard enough to last days. They are not pleasant, but they are reliable. Cheese follows, wrapped tightly, eaten in small pieces to make it last. Dried fish, smoked meat. Sometimes fruit if the season allows. Food here is chosen not for pleasure, but for endurance. And yet, even on the road, people find ways to cook. The most prized object is small and unremarkable, a simple iron pot, hung from a pack animal, tied to a cart, or carried by hand. This pot is freedom. With it, anything can become a meal. Grain boiled in water becomes pottage. Bread soaked becomes soup. A scrap of meat changes everything. Pottage appears again and again in records for travelers. Because it solves problems, it stretches ingredients, it tolerates improvisation, it forgives mistakes. A handful of oats, a bit of barley, some herbs pulled from a hedge. and suddenly there is warmth. At night, roadside fires flicker like cautious stars, dozens of them sometimes, each with a pot suspended over flames, each with travelers crouched close, hands extended toward heat. Cooking on the road is never solitary for long. Someone always wanders closer. Someone asks what is in the pot. Someone offers a piece of cheese in exchange for a ladle. Food becomes currency for trust. Sharing happens not because people are generous, but because isolation is dangerous. On the road, companionship is safety. And nothing builds companionship faster than eating from the same pot. A pilgrim breaks bread and hands half to a stranger. A soldier offers broth in exchange for news. A merchant shares cheese to secure a watchful eye overnight. These small exchanges turn movement into fellowship. The sounds here are muted but constant. Twigs snapping under fire, iron clinking against wood, low voices trading stories while waiting for grain to soften, horses shifting their weight nearby, the wind moving through hedges. The food is plain. No one pretends otherwise. But it is hot, and on the road that matters more than flavor. There are lean nights, of course, when the pot holds little, when bread is gone, when foraging fails. Records hint at desperate measures, roots dug hastily, nuts gathered, rabbits trapped if luck allows. Soldiers' accounts are more blunt. When supplies ran out, leather was boiled, belts softened in water until barely edible. It sounds extreme, but it appears often enough to be credible. Cooking on the road is a gamble. Sometimes logistics succeed. Sometimes hunger follows closely behind. Historians still debate how well-fed medieval armies were, but the consensus leans toward inconsistency. One night, plenty. The next, barely enough. Yet even then, the act of cooking persists. Fires are lit carefully. Pots are shared. People wait together for something warm. The road teaches a lesson quickly. Food is not guaranteed, but routine helps the body endure. As dawn approaches, pots are scraped clean. Fires are stamped out. Nothing lingers. The meal leaves no trace except a fuller stomach and a memory of warmth. Then the road calls again. And eventually, the road leads to water. At the shore, everything tightens. Cooking at sea is not an extension of road cooking. It is its own discipline shaped by motion, salt, and risk. On a ship, space is limited, fire is dangerous, and freshness disappears almost immediately. The diet narrows. Salted meat dominates, beef, pork, or fish, packed in brine until it loses nearly all resemblance to its original state. Alongside it comes hard biscuit, dense, dry bread baked until it could survive months without molding. The biscuit is infamous for a reason. It is so hard that teeth struggle, so dry that it steals moisture from the mouth, often riddled with insects. Sailors learn to soak it before eating, dunking it into broth, ale, or water until it's softened enough to bite. This soaking becomes ritual. Lift, dunk, wait, bite. Pick out what wriggles if you must. Eat anyway. Fresh water is precious at sea, so cooking liquid is reused constantly. Pots boil the same brine day after day. The flavor intensifies, salt accumulates. The stew grows harsher, not better, but it remains food. The galley itself is cramped. Fires are contained in iron boxes filled with sand to prevent sparks. Smoke hangs low, pressed down by wind and motion. The smell is unmistakable. Salt, wet wood, boiled meat, Rope, always rope. Cooking here is physical negotiation. A cook braces himself as the deck rolls. Every stir must anticipate movement. Every ladle is controlled. Spills are not just waste. They are danger. Despite the monotony, small variations matter enormously. A catch of fresh fish changes morale instantly. Cheese appearing in rations feels luxurious. Onions or dried beans break the endless salt. Ale, safer than water, is rationed carefully. Stronger drink is saved for storms or celebrations, and hierarchy survives even here. Officers eat better. Their bread is slightly softer. Their meat sometimes seasoned. Sailors notice. Envy simmers quietly, mixed with resignation. Even surrounded by open water, rank sits at the table. Historians argue over the nutritional adequacy of these diets. Some claim the calories were sufficient. Others point to widespread illness. Scurvy appears repeatedly in accounts. Swollen gums, weak limbs, fatigue that no amount of biscuit can fix. The truth likely mirrors the road. Sometimes enough, sometimes not. Spoilage adds another layer of risk. Barrels leak, meat turns rancid, biscuit molds. Sailors cut away the worst parts and eat the rest. Hunger does not allow refinement. Diaries mention eating in the dark to avoid seeing what crawls. It is not pleasant. It is survival. And yet even here, meals gather people together. Sailors eat in groups. They complain together, joke together, share stories while chewing grimly. A thin stew still creates a pause in labor, a moment when hands stop pulling ropes and mouths do something else. Food becomes the anchor of routine in a world where nothing else is stable. The sounds of shipboard eating blend with the ship itself. Rigging creaks, waves strike the hull, bowls clink. Someone hums quietly, trying to soften the taste of salt with memory. When land finally appears, meals improve almost immediately. Fresh bread, vegetables, anything green. The relief is visible, but the lessons linger. On the road and at sea, cooking strips away pretense. There is no artistry here, no spectacle, no display of power beyond simple survival. And yet these meals matter as much as any feast. They keep bodies moving. They keep groups intact. They turn endurance into routine. As you step off the ship or leave the road behind, the smell of salt clings stubbornly, not just to clothes, but to memory, because food eaten under strain imprints itself deeply. The pot on the road, the biscuit at sea, the shared ladle under a cold sky. These are not romantic meals, but they are honest ones, and they remind us of something essential. Medieval cooking was not confined to kitchens. It followed people wherever life demanded movement. And in doing so, it proved that food was not only culture or comfort, it was resilience. The wind fades, the ropes fall silent, the fire in its iron box dies down, and with that, we are ready to move again. Because not all cooking tests endurance through distance. Some test it through danger, and finally we step behind everything. The work no one names, where smoke, danger, and invisible hands hold every meal together. After roads and waves, after salt and endurance, the story circles back inward, not to the table, not to the dish, but to what made eating possible at all. Every medieval meal, whether swallowed quickly on a street corner or admired beneath banners and candles, passed through the same narrow gate first, the kitchen. And kitchens were not gentle places. They were dangerous by design. Fire sat open at the center of homes and halls. No insulation, no barriers. Sparks leapt freely. Thatched roofs waited patiently above, ready to ignite. Records from towns and villages are blunt about this. Fires did not announce themselves politely. They arrived suddenly, often during cooking, and they spread faster than people could react. A stray ember, a log, shifting unexpectedly. A cloth hung too close. Entire rows of houses vanished this way, sometimes a whole neighborhood. Cooking could turn survival into catastrophe in minutes, and fire was only the beginning. Cauldrons were heavy and unstable, hung from chains or perched on tripods. They boiled violently. When they tipped, the results were immediate and unforgiving. Court rolls mention children scalded, servants burned, skin ruined for life by moments of imbalance. Even a small splash left scars. Knives were sharp and plentiful. They slipped. Spits jabbed. Iron pans crushed toes when dropped. Lifting hot metal without protection was normal. Cloths wrapped around hands were the closest thing to safety equipment. Smoke filled everything. Most kitchens lacked proper chimneys. Smoke drifted upward, then settled back down. Eyes watered, lungs burned. Chronic coughs appear repeatedly in descriptions of kitchen workers, especially women. Breathing clean air was a luxury reserved for outdoors. To cook was to inhale fire daily. Historians debate how common accidents were. Some argue that people raised around fire developed skill and caution. Others point to the sheer volume of burn scars visible in skeletal remains and the frequency of household fire records. Both can be true. Familiarity reduces panic. It does not eliminate risk. But the most overlooked danger was not fire or blade. It was invisibility. Every kitchen relied on labor that was barely acknowledged at all. Below the cooks stood the scullions, the drudges, the children. Household accounts mention them briefly, if at all. Boys and girls, sometimes as young as 8, assigned the worst tasks: hauling water, scrubbing pots blackened with soot, plucking poultry until fingers blistered, scouring floors with sand and rushes soaked in grease. While guests admired golden pies above, these children worked knee-deep in filth below. After feasts, the work multiplied. Trencher plates had to be cleared, cauldrons scraped, knives polished, spits cleaned, grease removed from every surface, cold water, rough hands, endless repetition. And then it began again the next day. Payment for this work was uncertain. Some received a pittance, others were simply fed and housed. A bed of straw in a corner, scraps from the table once the important people were finished. Those scraps mattered. Leftover bread, ale dregs, bones stripped of most meat. These were often better than what peasants ate at home, yet the inequality was unmistakable. Servants ate last, often cold, often standing. They were present but never centered. Satirical poems noticed them in their way, not kindly. Kitchen boys mocked for their smell, reeking of onions, of smoke, of grease that never quite washed off. The joke worked because everyone recognized it. Kitchen labor clung to bodies. You could smell a scullion before you saw one. Smoke embedded itself in hair and skin. Grease settled into nails. Even away from the hearth, their work announced them. And yet this labor was essential. Without these children, no pot was clean, no spit turned again, no feast reset for tomorrow. They carried the kitchen forward silently. Danger followed them closely. Heavy pans fell. Knives slipped in small hands. Boiling broth splashed onto bare arms. Accidents were not exceptional. They were expected. Children were replaceable in the eyes of employers. Another could always be hired. This is the hardest truth behind medieval meals. Survival depended on labor that consumed the young early. Some scullions advanced. A few learned to chop herbs, to stir stews, to assist cooks, rarely to rise. Most did not. Most stayed where grease and smoke pooled lowest. And yet even here, humanity persisted. Servants joked quietly while scrubbing, sang under their breath, carved initials into benches, stole mouthfuls of food when they could, laughing softly at small victories. Resistance did not look heroic. It looked practical. The kitchen soundscape reflects this, not the grand noise of feasts, but the scrape of sand against iron, water sloshing, pots clattering into troughs, the occasional sharp yelp when something went wrong. And over it all, orders barked by cooks under pressure. The hierarchy was strict. Artisans above, drudges below. But without the bottom, the structure collapsed. Even outside great houses, risk remained constant. Villages lost homes to kitchen fires. Families inhaled smoke nightly. Food spoiled without warning. Grain carried fungi. Milk soured. People fell ill without understanding why. Cooking made food safer, but never completely safe. The irony is sharp. The same fire that symbolized warmth and life stalked families relentlessly. Every meal balanced nourishment against danger. And people accepted this. They accepted scars as part of living. Burns as memory, smoke as companion. This was not tragedy, it was routine, which makes the final truth unavoidable. Medieval kitchens did not function because of great cooks alone. They functioned because countless unnamed bodies absorbed risk daily. Children, servants, women, people whose names rarely survived ink. History remembers kings who feasted. It forgets those who washed the pots. But the pots tell their own story, blackened, scarred, warped by heat, evidence of hands that lifted them again and again. Every table rested on that effort. So when we picture medieval food, it is tempting to see only the surface, the pie, the stew, the spectacle, the survival. But beneath it all lies this quiet foundation. The kitchen ran because someone scrubbed until their hands bled, because someone breathed smoke so others could eat, because someone stayed invisible long enough for the meal to appear effortless. And that is the logic that holds everything together. The kitchen operated on memory that did not record names. It remembered only function. As the fire dims and the last pot cools, the workers fade back into shadow. Tomorrow they will return. The risk will return. The labor will begin again. No thanks spoken aloud. But without them, nothing would have reached the table at all. The meal ends. The danger remains. And the kitchen, quietly prepares to do it all again. And at last, we arrive at what remains. Not a dish, but a system where all these kitchens connect quietly to carry life from one night to the next. Medieval cooking was never just about food. It was a system made of constraints rather than choices, of repetition rather than inspiration, of bodies adapting quietly to what existed, not what was desired. Over the course of this night, you have moved through that system piece by piece, not by following heroes or events, but by standing near fires long enough to notice patterns. You began in a smoke-darkened kitchen where one woman knew exactly how to cook, yet never knew what she would have to cook with. Skill lived in her hands, not in her pantry. From there, you traced a web of female labor stretching across generations, where cooking was never solitary, never romantic, and never optional. You saw how the same space that fed a household also treated fevers, burns, and births, because survival did not separate nourishment from care. You laughed softly at medieval humor that mocked burned stews and scolding wives, not because it was cruel, but because it revealed something obvious to everyone at the time. The kitchen mattered so much that it became comedy. And you watched how, on rare feast days, that same space briefly transformed. Dough became art. Honey appeared. Gratitude remained mostly unspoken. Then the system widened. Food became contract in guild halls, measured in ounces, regulated, counted, and enforced. It became spectacle shaped into heraldic beasts and sugar towers, where every bite quietly restated who stood above whom. It spilled into the streets as something faster, louder, and more immediate, where a hot pie could mean comfort, convenience, or simple survival, depending on who held it. You followed food beyond walls, onto roads where a single iron pot turned strangers into companions, and onto ships where salted meat and hard biscuit tested endurance itself. You saw how rank survived even on rolling decks, and how hunger erased any illusion of fairness. Finally, you stepped behind everything, into smoke, burns, grease, and the labor of those whose names were never written down. Children scrubbing pots, servants breathing smoke, hands cracked, bodies bent, accidents accepted as routine. The system held because they absorbed its cost. Taken together, none of this forms a heroic narrative. And that is the point. Medieval cooking does not need an epic. It does not ask for drama. It unfolds in habits. In the decision to stretch a pot of pottage one more meal, in the choice to soak bread instead of discarding it, in the quiet competence of people who learned, through repetition, how to make enough last just long enough. History often tempts us to look upward, toward halls, banners, and declarations, but most of the past lived lower than that. It lived at waist height, near embers, where people leaned forward, not to be remembered, but to keep going. What you have heard tonight is not a story of triumph or collapse. It is a record of maintenance, of systems that worked, not because they were kind or fair, but because they were flexible. They allowed substitution. They allowed improvisation. They allowed people to survive without needing the world to change first. There is something quietly reassuring in that. It reminds us that humanity's most durable achievements are often invisible. They look like routine. They sound like wooden spoons tapping iron pots. They smell like smoke that never quite leaves clothing. They feel like hands doing the same task again without applause. And perhaps that is why this kind of history can feel calming. It does not demand excitement. It does not rush. It does not insist on meaning beyond continuity. It simply shows how people arranged their lives so that tomorrow remained possible. If your mind feels slower now, that is fitting. Because medieval cooking was slow, not leisurely but deliberate. Time passed in cycles rather than deadlines. Meals returned. Fires were relit. The same motions repeated until they became instinct. And within that repetition, people found a strange stability. They did not romanticize it. They normalized it. And that normalization is perhaps the most human thing of all. So if tonight you feel yourself settling, breathing more evenly, letting the noise of larger stories fade, that is not an accident. You have been listening to a history that lives at human scale, one where survival depends less on ambition and more on attention, on noticing what still works and doing it again. No grand conclusions are required, just this quiet understanding that long before modern kitchens, modern recipes, or modern comforts, people learned how to keep themselves alive through small, repeatable acts. They bent toward fire, they stirred, they waited, they shared. And when they could, they added a little sweetness. That system never truly disappeared. It changed its tools, it changed its language, but it still asks the same thing of us: to tend what we have, to adapt when resources thin, to accept that not every night needs a feast, only enough warmth to sleep. So let the images soften now. A pot settling back onto embers, a room growing quieter, the last scrape of a spoon. History does not need to shout to endure. Sometimes it only needs to simmer. And now, with the fire low and the work done for the day, you can rest.